They say right before you level up into the greatest version of yourself, you have to be beaten down so badly that it makes it almost impossible to get up. Or you can just make a shit movie and pull a creator back from retirement to then relaunch an old series and introduce it to a new audience and then create a new series on top of that. Enter Dragon Ball in the 2010s.
Dragon Ball Z Kai.
After Dragon Ball Z ended on Toonami, things started just feeling a little bit different. Not just for Dragon Ball, but as Toonami as a whole. You see, a lot of shows that defined that era were also coming to an end. And then that excitement and that feeling, unfortunately, really just wasn't hitting the same anymore. The kids that grew up during this time, like me, well, we were growing up. We had different priorities. Now, yes, I know that in America, we did eventually get Dragon Ball GT. And while I think Super Saiyan 4 is still one of the coolest transformations ever in the franchise, and GT still probably has the greatest ending of all of Dragon Ball, you can tell that the series was basically starting losing its steam. It just didn't hit the same cultural heights that Dragon Ball Z did.
A true warrior.
This fusion, it's unbelievable.
Echo shotgun!
Then on 2007, on March 17th, Tom was redesigned into his final form. Basically, well, Tom 4. I would honestly say it was probably his worst design ever. It really didn't mix with that futuristic 2000s vibe that was going. And I get it, we were heading into a different time period. And not long after that, on September 20th of 2008, Toonami aired its final broadcast after an 11-year run on Cartoon Network. And just like that, it really felt like the end of an era. And with the ending of Toonami, a lot of Dragon Ball fans were left wondering, was this really it? Was this really the last time we were going to see Goku? Well, don't you worry, because in 2009 we get even more Dragon Ball. Yeah, that's called Dragon Ball Evolution. Quite possibly the most insulting piece of media I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Watching this movie honestly felt like I was getting repeatedly skull fornicated by a grade 8 for an hour and a half straight. I generally don't even know what the hell this thing was even supposed to be in this movie. Like, what is that? God, I hate this movie. You know what was the only good thing about this movie? That it was over. Around that time, it was the rise of YouTube and online fandom. There was the point where people would have discussion boards talking about Dragon Ball. You had the rise of Dragon Ball AMVs where people would put Linkin Park and like songs of Nickelback in there. It was when a lot of us were discovering that Dragon Ball had a much bigger culture in Japan. The community was basically what was keeping Dragon Ball alive. However, the drought of having no Dragon Ball anime finally ended in America on May 24th of 2010. Entered Dragon Ball Z Kai. It was a full relaunch of the series and a way to introduce it to a new audience. It did air a year after Japan, and this was basically promoted as the definitive way to watch Dragon Ball. It cut off all the filler, a much faster paced show, and something that was closer to the manga. And at the same time, it was almost an HD remaster from the beginning of the show. However, Dragon Ball Z Kai wasn't greeted with the greatest welcoming as it was in the 2000s.
Stay here! Now stay out of my way!
But the problem wasn't the filler changes, it was the voice changing. See, some of the voice actors were switched up for certain characters that we've grown fond of. What really didn't help it was the fact that Dragon Ball Z Kai was broadcasting in a completely different channel. Toonami was gone, so they had to put the show in Nicktoons. And unfortunately, the show was censored quite heavily, way more than Z was back in Toonami. And lots of fans saw that as a massive downgrade, and I don't really blame them for that. And to be honest, I was also one of those. I hated Dragon Ball Z Kai at the time. I was like, why is this even in here? Why is the new generation watching a lesser washed down version of the show? And still to this day, that misconception of that Dragon Ball Z Kai is kid friendly is still going on even in today's era. And granted, that is not the case. Dragon Ball Z Kai is fantastic. To be fully honest, it is the way that I mostly watch the show. And not only that, it's also the music. You didn't have Bruce Faulconer in this anymore. So those themes of the Super Saiyan 3 theme, the Pikkon theme, the Vegeta's Hell Bells, those are all gone. And those big epic moments just never really compared to what Dragon Ball Z did. And those moments where characters go through a massive transformation do matter. Those are the highlights of the shows. Those are what stick with us for years. But it does make up for it with its voice acting. The people that worked on Dragon Ball Z, like Sean Shamwell, Christopher Sabat, and so many others, they weren't rookies anymore. They were now seasoned veterans.
Have as much access to information about the show when I first started it. We've worked on it for so long, I know it intimately, and now I can bring some of that back to the the Dragon Ball Kai dub.
Unfortunately, even though Dragon Ball Z Kai had lots of pros, it never reached the same viewership that Dragon Ball Z did in the 2000s. That decline basically ended the show with 98 episodes, concluding in the Cell arc. Not only that, but Dragon Ball Z Kai was also faced with a massive controversy that a lot of people have already heard. Is the Yamamoto music controversy. And that did not help Dragon Ball Z Kai whatsoever. In fact, they had to relaunch the series again and broadcast it with the Kikuchi score and replace the soundtrack that was originally put for that series. The show did eventually come back due to the massive success of Dragon Ball Z Battle Gods, and around 2014, Dragon Ball Z Kai the final chapters released, and it was basically the continuation of the Majin Buu arc. Unfortunately, it didn't really get the same treatment that Dragon Ball Z Kai did, the original run. It wasn't in 4x3 anymore, it was again in 16:9, and there were two versions. There was the Japan exclusive, and it was the one that we got here in America. It was just weird, and we also had this greenish tint over Dragon Ball Z Kai. It just really never made sense. Now, one of the things that actually did keep Dragon Ball alive throughout the years before we ended up getting Z Kai was the video games. While these games basically came before the 2010s, we had to mention them. Dragon Ball Z Burst Limit, which is the first HD Dragon Ball game transitioning from the PlayStation 2, that came on the 360 and the PlayStation 3. It was basically this Dragon Ball Z Budokai mixed with Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai from the PSP games. It was a gorgeous game, and some of the visuals still held up really well. And I would say that the Goku transformation is still one of my favorite things in any of the Dragon Ball games that we've gotten.
You just keep killing innocent people, one after another. Even Krillin. Now, I'm truly angry! Breathe out!
Unfortunately, this game is unfinished because it ended on the Cell arc, and I honestly believe if we really would have gotten a second game to this, it would have been pretty amazing. But of course, it was also the end of an era, with the final Dragon Ball game releasing on the PlayStation 2 being Dragon Ball Z Infinite World. And this was, for a lot of people, when you think about it, Budokai 4. And this game was really big and massive. It improved on a lot of things that Budokai 3 did, especially getting rid of that horrible mini game like Dragon Rush thing. But I would say one of the biggest things was the Raging Blast era. This was basically the Tenkaichi series in an HD format. It didn't really play like Budokai Tenkaichi, it had similarities to it, but it did include Super Saiyan 3 Vegeta and Super Saiyan 3 Broly for the first time. And back then, not having any new Dragon Ball stuff, this was freaking awesome. Unfortunately, with the music controversy that happened with Yamamoto, this not only affected Dragon Ball Z Kai, but it affected future Dragon Ball games in general. For example, Raging Blast 2 was one of its victims. There are two batches of this game. The original one that released when it first came out, which has the Yamamoto score in there, and then there's batch number 2, which has the Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2 soundtrack in place of it. I remember being mind blown about this because I have the original version still with me, which I think it's a holy grail at this point. And then my cousin ended up getting Dragon Ball Z Raging Blast 2 later for Christmas. And when we played it at his house, I was like, wait a minute, the soundtrack is different. Well, what's going on? I then went back to my house, brought my game, put it on his Xbox, and we were both stunned. We were like, wait a minute, we have two different versions of it. It's pretty crazy. So if you have a Raging Blast game, check out which version you have. Now, while Raging Blast was decently praised, we ended up getting, unfortunately, for a lot of people would say, the worst Dragon Ball Z game to ever come out. And that is Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Tenkaichi. Yeah, this game is basically just a rock, paper, scissors simulator. It sucks, unfortunately. However, the visuals are really damn good. I will still say that this game holds up really well, and it's really cool that when you are fighting, you can see the terrain getting destroyed even more and more. It definitely had really good immersion that you are basically playing the anime. The characters models were great, and it did include a cool mode, the hero mode, which is something that was going to be utilized for future Dragon Ball games, and I honestly thought it was pretty good. Also, let's be honest here, the Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Tenkaichi, while it's not a good game, it has an amazing soundtrack. Holy crap, this game has one of the best Dragon Ball soundtracks ever. Unfortunately, later on, then we ended up getting the Dragon Ball Z 4 Connect, which for a lot of people also say it's a horrible Dragon Ball game. Honestly, it's not that bad. It really does make you feel like you are in a Dragon Ball battle, and you definitely feel like you're turning into a Super Saiyan. Man, I feel so stupid. Ow! Now, with the downfall with Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Tenkaichi not doing as well, we ended up getting a Dragon Ball Z Budokai HD remake, and it included the first game and the third game. And with the music, it was also replaced from the original Budokai series because that was composed by Yamamoto. There were also the 3DS games, which were pretty fun and interesting. There was one called Extreme Butoden, which this was made by Arc System Works. These guys are the same ones that worked and made Dragon Ball FighterZ. And you can definitely tell when you play this game. It was really fast and responsive. And of course, there was also Dragon Ball Fusions, which is the most wackiest Dragon Ball game ever. You can fuse with anybody. It was pretty cool. Now, with Dragon Ball Z Battle of Z, this game was, I would call it, the blueprint of what the gameplay system was for Xenoverse. And it was the first time that we were introduced to Super Saiyan God in a video game, and to Beerus and Whis, and to hear their voice lines in English, because we didn't get the dub for the movie at the time. This was our first time hearing them, so it was always pretty interesting. I mean, this era was massive. There was the launch of Dragon Ball Online. It didn't live as long as we hoped so, but some of the elements that were in this MMO did make their ways into the Dragon Ball Heroes games that we see now very popular in Japan with the card systems, and the Switch game that we ended up getting a few years later. But at the same time, it also was something that was utilized for the Dragon Ball Xenoverse games. And while Xenoverse 1 was rather decent, Xenoverse 2, well, we all know how that is. That is the longest running Dragon Ball game that we've had. And then of course comes the final Dragon Ball game in that era, was Dragon Ball Z Fighters. This game for a lot of people is the greatest Dragon Ball fighting game of all time. It bridged casual fans and normal fighting fans together. Dragon Ball was slowly coming back. We were getting new OVAs like Dragon Ball Yo Son Goku and his friends, which introduced Turbo, Vegeta's younger brother. It had the Bardock Returns episode, which basically had Bardock turning into a Super Saiyan. And then we had game and OVA crossovers like the Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans remake through Raging Blast 2. There were other ones like the Dream 9 Toriko and One Piece Dragon Ball Z collaboration special. There were Dragon Ball rides and attractions in Japan, like the Dragon Ball Z 4D. It became a real entertainment experience for Dragon Ball. I really wish we had that in America. And of course, we had to mention the toys. Of course, in the 2000s, Dragon Ball was everywhere. In this era, it was slowly coming back up. We ended up getting these Bandai figures that were around like the 4 inches or 3.5 inches figures. They were pretty cool. The line didn't really live that long, but it was also the rise of the SH Figuart brand, which became this premium format of collecting figures for collectors. I would say one of my favorite things and the biggest thing was, of course, again, the physical medias for Dragon Ball Z. And of course, the first one was Dragon Ball Z Kai on Blu-ray. Now, there were 2 versions of this. There was the original version, which was listed as the parts, which had the original Yamamoto score, and then there was the season sets that were released later on and basically included the Kikuchi score. The versions of these were really good because these are fully uncut. It just looked great. Honestly, I would say it's the definitive way to watch Dragon Ball in the only format that you can basically own right now, minus the Dragon Ball Z final chapters. But we also did get the Dragon Ball Z level sets, which this, if Dragon Ball Z Kai wasn't included, was going to be the greatest format ever. Unfortunately, it only ended up getting 2 releases and it got canceled right away. But in replacement of that, we ended up getting the Dragon Ball Z Blu-ray sets, which were basically the orange brick sets, just moved over to that more high definition era. It did help some of the cropping. It was still cropped, but honestly, it's not that bad. They also did release later on a Dragon Ball Z Rock the Dragon set, which was basically for everybody that grew up watching the Ocean dub in the beginning. There is a set that is very polarized for Dragon Ball fans, and it was the Dragon Ball Z 30th Anniversary box set. And I mean, I ended up getting it. It was pretty cool. It was neat. They were putting this out as the definitive version of Dragon Ball Z. Unfortunately, it wasn't fully 4:3. It was somewhat slightly cropped. It still looked pretty good, honestly. If I would compare it to the Blu-ray release that we got, this is the better version, but this also was re-released again into a steelbook version, which is now out of print. But then around 2013, that's when Dragon Ball fully came back with the release of Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods, a full brand new continuation of the Dragon Ball story. It introduced new characters like Beerus, Whis, and of course the new transformation at the time, Super Saiyan God. And I remember a lot of people comparing Super Saiyan God to Kaioken. There were so many advertisements and collaborations. Goku was eating KFC. And then a few years later, again, we ended up getting Dragon Ball Z Resurrection F, which brought back Frieza and introduced Golden Frieza and a new transformation. Really quick, mind you, Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, or how you would say Super Saiyan Blue now. However, I had a horrible experience watching this movie in the theater. I went to the theater with my dad, sister, and cousins, and right as the movie was playing in the movie theater, it literally started the intro and then it stopped. The screen went black and the movie skipped all the way to the ending of Goku killing Frieza. The theater was pissed. I was pissed. I was like, how can you do that? How can that even happen? But somehow we knew that there was going to be more. And it was just the appetizer of basically us getting a brand new anime, Dragon Ball Super. And this was exciting. I mean, the news were everywhere. Dragon Ball officially fully coming back. And again, canon with new adventures and everything. The only problem of it was that it still rubbed me the wrong way, is that it always took place before the 10-year skip. So like before Oops. And let me tell you, the show, as amazing and exciting it was played with insanely horrible animation. It was so rushed. The quality was just not there. Fortunately enough, it did improve overall as the later arcs came out, like the Universe 6 arc, the Goku Black arc, of course, and the Amazing Tournament Power arc. But the show definitely had some amazing feats. I mean, Goku versus Jiren still goes to this day as the greatest fight ever in an anime worldwide. Everybody tuned in. Crunchyroll, bro, it's insane. I mean, look at the crowds. Look at all that. Even Goku was an ambassador for the Olympics. That's insane. Dragon Ball was back and it was giving those feelings of the early 2000s again. Side note, let's just talk about James Marster for a second, the voice of Zamasu. He was actually Lord Piccolo in that awful Dragon Ball Evolution, and he felt so bad that he actually took the Zamasu role without salary. And with the ending of Dragon Ball Super, we ended up getting, I would say, and for a lot of people, the greatest Dragon Ball movie ever made, called Dragon Ball Super Broly. I mean, the animation was beautiful and crisp, and honestly, this is what Dragon Ball needs to look like moving forward. While the ending of Toonami gave Dragon Ball a few rough years, was somewhat decent to mediocre games, the series still carried on, and it just gives you a testament to how great this series is in general, and just the community all around. You have fans that have grown up, become teenagers, and even adults, and have had kids of their own, and are going to conventions, meeting the voice actors, making friends through Dragon Ball. It's so cool seeing that the show that you watched as a kid actually had a bigger impact than you originally thought. I mean, for me, I've been showing my nephew Dragon Ball Z, and he's about to go watch Daima and Super, and it's just cool seeing a new generation experience what we experience. It's awesome to see that, and I will wholeheartedly say that Dragon Ball in the 2010s grew the franchise even bigger than it would originally did in the 2000s. And if you guys enjoy these type of videos and we look back at certain eras, movies, video games, and just pop culture in general, go ahead and check out the rest of the channel. And like Beerus says, before creation comes destruction.